Eric, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. I'm a professor of philosophy at University of California, Riverside. I got my PhD in 1997 from Berkeley in philosophy and went to Stanford as an undergraduate before that.
Cool. What are you currently studying and interested in?
Well, I've got a book in press with Princeton University Press called The Weirdness of the World. And my previous book before that was A Theory of Jerks and Other Philosophical Misadventures. And I work on all kinds of stuff. I have actually many parallel interests.
So I'm an atheist, moral realist, and I've been debating theists for a very long time. And what is your position on that topic, if you don't mind my asking? Does God exist?
I'm an agnostic-leaning atheist.
Yeah.
I used to be an atheist in the following sense. I thought, okay, my degree of belief that God exists is about the same as my degree of belief that my car is still where I parked it. Which is to say, it's not impossible that it was stolen or towed or, my spouse took it or something like that, but not very likely. And I figured that's enough confidence. I'm going to say I believe that my car is there. I know that my car is there. Right? That seems like enough confidence to qualify as an atheist. But recently, I have been thinking we know less about the fundamental structure of the world than we think we do. That's partly what my forthcoming book is about. And in light of that, I think that it's not unreasonable to attribute a small degree of credence, more than the parking lot case, to the possibility of a God. That said, my money is on no God.
Yeah. Are you a moral realist, and what is your position on morality? Do we need God for objective morality?
I am a moral realist, and I don't think we need God for objective morality.
What? You can have morality without a God?
I guess that's your view. So, so I assume this surprise is fake.
Yes.
Right. So I think that there's such a thing as human flourishing and flourishing in general of things in the world, and that morality is the kind of thing that instantiates and leads to flourishing of that sort.
Cool. And what instantiates the objectiveness of that? How is it true, independent of subjective opinion?
Well, the easy answer to that, if there is an easy answer at all, is that part of it is constituted by pleasure or happiness, which I think we can just regard as objective goods. The real answer, I think, is considerably more complex than that, because I'm not a hedonist in the sense that I don't think all value comes down to pleasure. But I think that's a good starting point. I think that it's reasonable to say that pleasure is objectively good.
What does that mean for pleasure to be objectively good? What is an objective good in this context?
Well, I guess here we might inquire into what we mean by the word objective. What's our purpose in employing that word?
I would say like objective usually means, or usual context is something true, independent of opinion, something in correspondence with reality, or something along those lines.
Yeah, okay. Well, that pleasure is good is something that's true regardless of human opinion. So, for example, if there were bugs on a faraway planet who had lives of pleasure, but no sophisticated cognition such that they could have thoughts about whether pleasure was good or bad, it would still be good that the universe contained those bugs. Right? It's not their pleasures being good does not depend on our opinion about them or about their pleasure, or their opinions, which they can't have without pleasure.
Well, what does it mean there to say that it's good? Because like I don't think the universe would care one way or the other. And obviously
Uh-huh.
the thing likes pleasure. By definition, pleasure is enjoyable, some kind of enjoyable emotion of some kind. But what does it mean to say it's good? What would it, if we have a universe with it versus a universe without it? Why would one be in any sense better?
I think at some point you get to rely on foundational assumptions and intuitions. And here I think is kind of a stopping place. Here's one way I think about it. Now this is not going to convince somebody, I think, who's an opponent. It's more of an invitation to people who are on the fence, who are friends, so to speak. Right? So imagine a planet on the far side of the galaxy that with which we'll have no interaction whatsoever. We'll never see it. It's blocked by the galactic core. We'll never interact with it. We'll have no influence on us. We'll have no influence on it. What would you hope for, or what would be better for that planet? Is it better if that planet is just a dry, sterile rock, or is it better if the planet has life? If the planet has life, is it better that it has kind of complex life, or is it better just to have single cellular life? If it has complex life, is it better for it to have human beings with complex social interactions, with art and philosophy and sports and writing and falling in love and all of that, right? I think that most people would or should agree that the latter kind of planet is better. I think that's objectively better, independently of our thoughts about it. So I kind of use that just as a starting point. I mean, you could say why. I mean, like you can be a 2-year-old and just say why and why and why, and eventually you run out of answers. And philosophers are kind of like 2-year-olds in that way. But I think it also makes sense to say, hey, look, here's a starting point.
Well, for me, it seems like what's the difference between why was that a more reasonable starting point than God exists or something? Like it seems like you can make up any starting point you want, but there has to be some way to establish a good rational starting point versus an irrational starting point. There is a magical flying potato on Mars or something. And there's a comparison between moral realism and theism in that there seems to be a lack of empirical evidence of both. And so what makes one different than the other? Why would moral realism be more rational?
I disagree about the empirical issue here.
Oh, yeah?
Right. So I think you can kind of start wherever you want, more or less. I think we're given certain starting points through our culture. And then you subject those starting points to rational criticism. And that's where I think traditional theism and moral realism come apart. Right? So if you take, say, a traditional Christian theist view and you subject it to rational criticism, I don't think it survives all that well. There's not particularly good reason to think that these things happened historically that are claimed to have happened. You look at what the Bible says, it doesn't seem like it's an accurate depiction of what happened. So there is rational pressure. You look at what people from other cultures hold, and you say, well, look, I don't see more evidence for the religion of my culture than the religion for other cultures, right? So I think that the rational I started out as a child as a theist, but I don't think it survived rational critique. Whereas if when we look at moral realism, I think it does survive rational critique. And partly I think this because there is a lot of commonality in morality among cultures, right? So we don't have the cross-cultural disagreement to the same extent. So that's one dimension.
Well, could the theist say that most people are religious throughout the world? And so even if we don't have good reason to believe a particular version of theism, that theism itself is analogous to moral realism in that there is some kind of core central claim there, which is that God exists. And that would be analogous to the core central claims of morality, like drowning babies is wrong or something. But on the ambiguity state, on the parts that are kind of like gray areas, that would be more analogous to the individual religion doctrines.
Well, I don't know if most people are theists in the relevant sense across the world. So I'm interested in classical Chinese culture, and I don't think God exists in the sense that, say, Christians uh, or Muslims mean it in the Confucian or Taoist tradition.
Yeah, Confucianism, does he even have a god in that one? I don't know, but like,
Not really. I mean, modern Confucianism, it's different than classical Confucianism. But I mean, even if you talk about polytheistic traditions, they have gods, but that's so different from saying God exists in the monotheistic tradition.
right. But I'd say that it seems like a fair generalization to say that most humans believe in some kind of a mind thing that exists beyond us that created our physical universe in some sense, or the laws of physics, lightning, whatever. It seems like that's a genuine trend that exists in humanity.
Right. Um, that created the laws of physics. I don't know. I
Or
think you're coming from a. Oh no, it just transcends the laws of physics. Is that what you said? I mean, the very idea of the laws of
created
physics.
just the fundamental natures of reality, the things we don't understand, like lightning, or what we would describe as the laws of physics, but what they would describe as things they don't understand. So whatever the universe, the
Yeah.
fine tuning, the lightning, what
Right.
waters do, volcanoes. It seems like humans have a tendency to ascribe divine intention to things, all the things we don't understand, which we would now describe as physics.
Right. It seems like we have a better explanation now. We can appeal to modern physics. Now, we don't know what caused the Big Bang. So it's possible that the Big Bang was caused by some sort of creation event, right? I'm an agnostic in that sense, right? I think that's possible. We don't know, right? But the specific commitments of religions, they get much more detailed about uh, how, say, the Big Bang was caused. It seems like we have large amount of disagreement there, and what seems like scientific counter evidence where specific claims are being made.
But just in the context of the argument that there is a general agreement among most people that there is some property, like that morality is real, drowning babies is wrong, or whatever, and that there is a God or some higher level consciousness that runs the stuff that we don't understand. Both of those seem to be analogous arguments in the context
Uh,
of the fact that lots of people believe it, therefore
right.
it's reasonable or
No,
something.
well, right. So you flipped my argument around just a little bit, right? So my positive argument for moral realism isn't moral realism is true because lots of people believe it, right? What we did was we took moral realism as a starting point, and then we noticed that it's not undermined by disagreement, right? That's different from saying because people agree it's true. What it's saying is a certain kind of counter evidence against it doesn't exist, right? So I'm not committed to some principle whereby if people generally agree about it, it's probably true.
All right. Um, so in the mirrored version would be something like there is a limited amount of disagreement that there is some higher level consciousness running stuff. So the argument that the counter argument that there is no such thing would also not apply to theism in the
With
same
running
respect.
stuff, right? So,
Yeah,
I mean, I kind of feel like you're coming from a certain kind of theistic tradition here, right? In terms of this kind of monotheistic idea that there is a God who is a creator who's running stuff, right? I don't think that's the to the extent you say, okay, there's a lot of cross-cultural agreement about some sort of theism, I don't think that you see it in that form, right? That there is a kind of invisible, all-powerful deity who existed before the universe and then created it and is now running everything, right? That's a specific Western conception that doesn't have the kind of cross-cultural agreement, I think.
Right. The only analogous thing I'm arguing for here is that there is a higher level consciousness that controls the other stuff that we don't. Lightning,
Higher level
volcanoes.
control?
Yeah.
I don't see that in the ancient
Well, like, so
Confucians or
Hinduism has all their gods control like the specific elements. Native American Indians, same thing. Inuit, same thing. Norse Vikings, the Romans, same thing. There are, I'm pretty sure, pretty much the vast majority of all religions have this trait that there is some higher level consciousness that controls the stuff we don't understand. I don't know. There are obviously cases, like there's the one tribe who doesn't really have a god at all. I forget what they're called, starts with a P. There are definitely outlier cases, but there are outlier cases in morality as well, like psychopaths, sociopaths, people who have really strange views of morality. And so the fact that there are a minority of outliers, I don't think would apply to both cases, and wouldn't count as a counter argument to the main claim in either case. So like, it seems like the vast majority of religions entail a mind, and I think that's for evolutionary reasons. I think that makes sense.
I think there's a big difference between. I mean, I can let this go, but I just think there's a big difference between Thor and the monotheistic God. Right?
Oh, definitely.
Say, oh, they've got this thing in common that there's widespread cross-cultural agreement about. I mean, I just think, wow, what they have in common is not very much. But if you want to say, okay, whatever it is that Thor and the Taoist sense that there's, some force, and the monotheistic God of the Western traditions, whatever they have in common, you want to say, oh, there's cross-cultural agreement about that. Well, okay, maybe. But that's so thin. That's so thin.
Would that be different than the moral case?
Yes. I think one of the things that's really striking to me when I read ancient Confucianism, for example, is you read Confucius and it reads like ordinary common sense morality. It's not some thing that strikes you as, wow, what the heck's going on here, right? You read some other culture's religion and you're like, wow, this is strange. You read another culture's basic moral tenets and you don't have that reaction. Ancient Confucianism is as far as you can get from the current Western tradition and still have a large written corpus. You read that corpus and it's like, oh yeah, all of this makes sense. They're not advocating anything that's very strange. I mean, there's more emphasis than we tend to have on duties to your parents and to your family. There's less emphasis on individual rights, but it's not like way out there. So you read ancient Confucianism or ancient Taoism or ancient Moism, just to choose the Chinese examples, and it's like, oh yeah, I recognize all these things from my tradition. I'm really struck by, although of course people talk about and highlight and are very interested in moral differences among cultures, but what I'm really struck by is how much moral similarity there is among cultures. Every culture thinks you ought to take care of your children. Every culture has standards of honesty and respect. Every culture has, a sense of you got to be good to your kin and your in-group. That is substantive, the core of morality, and it's very widespread.
Well, so I'd agree with that, but I'd say that the same thing seems to apply to a God. Like in moral context, the vast majority of moral feelings, like should you run a red light, that's very subjective to a very specific culture that has red lights, very specific time frame. Or is drunk driving okay? Drunk horseback riding. People, when we feel those are immoral, that's clearly going to be a very subjective context to particular cultures. And it seems like the vast majority of those things seem to be very culturally driven. having multiple wives, having slaves, having beating your children. There's the most moral instances seem to be particularly driven by cultural inclinations, in the same way that there's a difference between Thor and Yahweh. There's probably going to be a difference between each particular culture's view on morality and drunk driving versus running red lights or multiple wives, whatever. And so the vast majority seem to have the same differences, and there's only some small core of similarities. And that core of similarities in morality is the things like don't murder, don't rape or steal or whatever in the vast majority of cases. But that seems to be analogous to the similarity in the religious cases of there is a mind thing that controls stuff. And that seems to be like the core of the
I
religious
think you're
ones.
cherry picking. I think you're cherry picking. Take the red light case, right? Of course, this is a law that's specific to a culture that has automobiles and certain systems, right? But that's way too specific. You're choosing a little detail of a culture, right? If you think instead about cross-cultural rules of the road, right? Every culture is going to have every culture that has transport like chariots and horses that is dangerous and has centers of population is going to say, don't ride your chariot at full speed right through where the kids are playing marbles, right? That's the moral equivalent to don't run red lights, right? We've got rules of recklessness, disregard for other people, and customs about how you should manage your transportation and drive responsibility that are going to be their specific manifestations are going to differ culturally, right? But the general principles at a middle level of generality, not a super high level of generality, a middle level of generality, like don't drive recklessly, are going to be widespread among cultures.
Middle level of
A middle level, that's the level to be at here, right? At the very, very top level of almost nothing in common, we've got Thor and Yahweh and the Taoist sense of a transcendent being, right? At a middle level of generality, we've got, say, there is a God who died and your and atone for your sins, or you have cycles of afterlife. Right? At that middle level of generality, there is a huge amount of cross-cultural disagreement in religion, but at that same appropriately middle level of generality, that's not the case for morality. That's my view.
what is the cutoff point? It seems very, I don't know, special plea that there's some middle ground of similarity, that this is enough similarity to say this is a fair argument in this case. I don't know how do you establish the level of similarity and agreement there?
I think it's plausible. I know you're playing the devil's advocate, but I give you these examples of middle level of generality. I think that a reasonable person listening to this would say, yes, middle level generality is stuff like God died for your sins and, don't drive recklessly, right? I think any reasonable sense of what's a middle level of similarity in terms of religion, the specifics of religion and the specifics of morality is going to say, yeah, those are about the same level of similarity, or even don't drive recklessly is more specific. I mean, it would be, I don't feel like you'd be arguing in good faith if you said, oh yes, whatever really abstract thing that Thor and the theistic God have in common, that's the same level of specificity as don't drive recklessly. That would be, I don't think you really would think that.
I don't know. It's hard for me to distinguish what levels those are and what they mean. I would say, like, for me, I think moralism makes more sense as like a law of physics kind of a thing, a thing that exists in the universe objectively. And So
Sorry,
it's
what
made.
makes sense as a law of physics?
I think morality, a moral realist
Morality.
perspective, like
Yep.
morality actually exists. It exists as an object of some kind, platonic object, whatever. I like law of physics. We're going to say it's law of physics. And so what makes it true is that it corresponds to reality to say something is true morally because of in whatever way it's instantiated by whatever object it exists as. And I don't see why the level of agreement would constitute a really good argument for moral realism. Because obviously I think that
It's not an
evolution.
argument for it. It's just not an argument against it. Right. And I
Right.
tried to clarify that earlier on. Right. So are we going down the wrong path? My view is not moral realism is true because people agree about it. If you think that if this line of reasoning is an attempt to undermine that, thinking that that's my argument, that's the wrong path. That's not
Right.
what I think.
Right. So to clarify, like, does providing an example of something that is not an argument against a position, what value does that have? Because I can say, this potato is not an argument against God. Like, you're right, it's not.
Right. Right. No, I think to go back to my positive argument, I think it's a starting point and an invitation, right? Think about this distant planet. Think about what's good. Think about promoting that's good. Think about happiness and pleasure. Recognize that that's good, right? These are starting points, that these things are good independently of what we think, right? Now, challenge, right? Show me that there's a problem with that view, right? That's my positive argument.
All right. So, what about the non-cognitivist who says it just doesn't make sense? Moral statements just are incoherent.
What's incoherent in what I just said?
What does that mean for something to be moral?
Well, I already gave a passing definition of that, right? That it constitutes or advances the flourishing of human goodness and other kinds of goodness in the world. That's coherent to say.
Oh yeah, for sure. But what is it that makes that statement true, that is moral? Why is that not just, I can define, I don't know, scratching my butt is moral or whatever, but the universe obviously doesn't care. There's no like objective truth value to that definition. So what is it that makes this true in the sense that by developing human well-being or well-being of conscious agents, it makes the universe, or it corresponds to some goodness? What is it corresponding to?
It constitutes the goodness. It's true because that's what goodness is. So it's like saying, hey, look, here's an electron. An electron is this thing. It's, has certain interactions with protons and neutrons. And then you say, oh, what constitutes it as an electron? What thing other than an electron makes it an electron? No, that you don't need to answer that question.
So you're saying like this, I don't know, how does that, like, so the social or psychological feeling of or well-being is like a thing in the universe? It's like an actually existing thing?
It is, yes, absolutely. Feeling good, having the experience of pleasure and feeling good, for sure, that's the thing that exists.
And we want to say more of that and less of the feeling of bad
constitutes goodness.
So
I mean, I'm reducing it to a hedonist position for the metaphilosophical purposes, even though I'm not a hedonist and I want to say there's more to it than that. But if we're just thinking metaphilosophically or metaethically, right, we can go with hedonism, right, and say, okay, let's just start with that, right? So the feeling of pleasure just is something good. There's no further thing that needs to be the case to make it good.
Because to me, so what would be if someone just says, I disagree with that definition? Or so, for example, you say, I think good is a universe with the most blue waves of light or something.
Well, let's do our thing with the electron. Someone says, oh, I disagree with your definition of an electron. An electron is a blue light wave. You're like, okay. you you can, I guess, use the word electron in that way, but that's not
All right, but
how I talk.
in the case of the electron, we can say there is actually this particular physical state that we can demonstrate independent of human opinion. Like here it is, and it has
Oh,
these
but our
effects.
blue light thing says, oh, but that's just not electrons. They're just using words differently, which I guess is their prerogative if they don't mind being misunderstood.
Oh, no, I'm saying something more than that. I'm saying that in the universe, there is some actual value of goodness. And in the universe, it is determining something is good. So this would be more analogous to saying that we have these effects of what we see as what an electron does. And we want to say, well, what is the electron? Maybe it's some magical blue light thingy, or maybe it's the particles that we are interacting with in quantum physics. And they're competing hypotheses here. And one of them is true, one of them is false, because there has to be some truth value that this thing is the correct instantiation of goodness and this thing is the incorrect instantiation of goodness, which means there has to be some fact of the matter in the universe to say one person is right, one person is wrong.
Yeah.
And so
if someone says, yeah, blue light is goodness, then they're wrong.
By virtue of what? The famous...
By virtue of the goodness of pleasure and the not particular goodness of blue light.
The not particular. But that seems to be more like our classification of it, not the innate properties of itself.
It's the same thing with electrons. Do the same thing with electrons, right? If someone says, I'm going to just define electrons as blue light, there's no physical experiment you can run that will prove them wrong. You do whatever you do with a bubble chamber, cloud chamber, and they'll be like, oh yeah, there's things curling around in there, right? I see, your laws of physics, but I'm not calling those things electrons. I'm going to call something else electrons. And
right, but no,
by that.
Well, I'm saying
you
there
can't
would
prove them wrong with physics.
Well, I'm saying there would hypothetically be some difference. So, like they're saying, the things we see as electrons, or the effects we see as electrons, are actually caused by this other thing. It's not really electrons. It's just
now they're making an empirical claim. The effects we see caused by electrons, right? So now you're committing them to some empirical claim that is going to be wrong, right? But that's not the person I was imagining. I was imagining a person who just says, no, blue light is electrons, and doesn't commit to any empirical claims that are wrong.
Well, right. So I'd say, like, in the context of goodness, wouldn't it be the same thing to say that this is goodness? You need some correspondence to reality, like an empirical test or something, to show that this is actually goodness, rather than something we're just making up, kind of like, I don't know, capitalism. Like, is it objectively the case that capitalism is like a factually thing that exists independent of opinion?
So what you're saying is that in order for someone to make a claim that something is goodness, they have to make an empirical commitment about what goodness causes and what tends to cause goodness. And if that empirical commitment is correct, then we've got kind of the moral objective facts we want. And if it's not, then you're off. Is that kind of what you're saying metaethically?
More like there needs to be some way to differentiate imagination from reality. So, like, if we're claiming that there is some objective truth value to some claim, that it means it's true more so than just we've made it up. We just decided to label X as Star Wars or whatever. I don't know, the Mona Lisa, just any of the subjective things we've made up that don't actually exist in the world. Capitalism, I don't know, fluffiness. I don't know. There's a lot of things.
Capitalism and fluffiness exist. Maybe you just don't think a lot of things exist. Maybe that's our problem here. I totally think capitalism and fluffiness exist.
Well, like, exist objectively independent of imagination. So, like,
sure.
I don't know what would be a good one. Bad at thinking of these, but there's clearly things that we've made up that don't exist, like unicorns. Unicorns don't exist.
I totally agree with that.
All right. And so if I said that if I take a plastic horn and tape it onto a horse, that unicorns exist. Ha, gotcha. Clearly, there's a fact of the matter that they're right or wrong. Some
Right.
claim
So if
about
we say, okay, look, in order to be this isn't the reason that isn't a proof that a unicorns exist is you say, okay, no, a unicorn, as we imagine it, is a living animal of a certain type, and this is not a living animal. All right. So the fake unicorn that you created doesn't meet the criteria, right? So
right.
to say the goodness doesn't exist, you would have to say, okay, here are the criteria that goodness should meet that, say, pleasure, if we just want to be hedonists about it for the moment, doesn't satisfy.
Right.
What
And
are
so
those criteria?
there'd be some independently existing standard by which pleasure could be deemed objectively good, independent of just our feelings or subjective things. So I'd say like the goodness would be like the unicorn. Our subjective feelings would be like the horse with the taped horn on it or something. And so the fact that we make it the shape of the goodness doesn't necessarily mean it is objectively goodness. For it to be objectively goodness, that means there has to be some fact of the matter in the universe that determines this is really the goodness, as opposed to just something we've labeled that way just because it's convenient for us.
I worry that you're mixing up epistemology and ontology here. So the things can exist objectively, even if we can't know facts about them or whether they exist. What makes something objectively, I'm not sure. That's not my favorite term. What makes something really exist is not anything about how we come to know it. It's a fact about what things hold in the universe. So we don't need to rely on some epistemic test. We don't want to build into our notion of existence that the thing has to be knowable to us by some test that we can apply.
What do you mean there? So, because if we don't build in that requirement, it seems like we could hypothetically just say anything we could imagine exists. So it seems like we need some added criterion to differentiate if we have reason to believe it actually exists versus if it's just something in our imagination. And so seemingly just starting with the criterion that we can imagine it does not seem to be a good reason to accept it as true as an actually existing object.
Right. Well, pleasure exists, right?
Sure.
We're on board with that.
Yep.
Right? And pleasure is good.
Well, if all you mean by goodness, go ahead.
Right? The pleasure is partly constitutive. Look, if I were a hedonist, I could say the following: all I mean by goodness, what you were about to put in my mouth, right? All I mean by goodness is pleasure.
Yep.
Right? And then as soon as you establish that pleasure exists, you've established that goodness exists.
Yeah.
Right? That would be similar to saying, look, all I mean by an electron is a particle that interacts in certain physical ways with an electric field and with protons and stuff like that. And as soon as I've established that exists, I establish that electrons exist, right?
Right.
So similarly for the hedonist, as soon as you establish that pleasure exists, you establish that goodness exists, right? Just kind of by definition. Now, I'm not a hedonist, so I think there can be cases of bad pleasure, for example, right? It's more complicated than that, right? But metaethically, my view is the same, right? Once you kind of latch on to the right thing, goodness exists simply by virtue of that thing existing. And whether that thing exists is something that we can, not always, but often, verify, check, establish empirically.
Well, so my question would be like, well, we could say that about any thought, feeling, perception, political ideology. All of those things exist in the mind as an idea in the mind. But normally when we say something exists objectively, we want something that exists true, independent of the mind, not just a figment of our imagination, because the things we come up with are like unicorns. Like obviously the idea of unicorns exists, but unicorns don't exist. And so the idea of goodness exists. It's an idea in our head, but does goodness exist? And so in the same way, we want to say, is this just a thing in our brains that we've made up and we like to label it just like unicorns? Or is it something more than that, that is like a true feature of reality.
So I'm a little worried about how you're using the word objectively, but maybe that's not our disagreement here. But let me just poke at it a little bit, right? So I think, I mean, there are at least two different senses. There are probably more than this of the term objective, right? One is something like really real, and another is something like independent of what's going on in human minds. Now, those senses can come apart because there's some really real stuff that happens in human minds. By the way, I owe this to Elizabeth Lloyd, my teacher in grad school, who has this wonderful paper on the term objective and its misuses. Right. So if you kind of use the word objective both to mean really real and to mean independent of our minds, then you kind of lose sight of the fact that there are really real things that are not independent of our minds. Like, for example, pleasure, right? Pleasure isn't independent of our minds, but it's real.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So like, but if we asked, is a foot objectively 12 inches or something? Well, we've totally made that up. There's no standard in the universe that makes a foot 12 inches. It's just something we've just labeled as this is a foot because it's convenient for us. And so if you want to know if it's objectively true that 12 inches is a foot, well, in human society it is. Sure, it's objectively the case that for me and you, 12 inches is a foot. But if it's real, if it's objectively real, objectively true to the universe, well, then we're going to need something a little more than human society. Now we got to say like, okay, which law of physics determines that this is 12 inches as a foot? And so we need something a little bit stronger than we just define it that way.
12 inches is a foot because we define it that way. So it really is a foot as a result of our definitions.
Right, absolutely. But nobody thinks that that would be equivalent to something being objective in the sense of a law of physics. Like if we want to say there is
a law of mathematics, the 12 inches is a foot.
Yeah, math is made up by humans.
More stronger than a law of physics.
Stronger than a law of physics.
It's a law of math, right? Once it's defined that way, it's just logic, right? You say, okay, a foot is these, and then you know, it's got to be 12.
I think it's a law of the metric system, or I forget what the other one is. The English.
Once you define the metric system, you apply the math, and you get, you're right. Oh yeah, 4 feet is 48 inches, right? That's a law of mathematics based on how we've defined, or that follows from the laws of mathematics based on how we've defined these terms. So
yeah, but we want to make a distinction between things that we can arbitrarily make up, like languages, like the metric system, and they don't have any kind of objective truth value in the universe, independent of human society. The truth value is completely contingent on human opinion, human definition. And in that context, most people see a difference.
That's quite right. I don't think that's quite right as a matter of philosophy of language.
What do you mean?
So once you define the terms, the truth value is independent of human cognition. Now you have to define the terms, and defining the terms is an act that we do, but that doesn't mean that the truth of what you've said after the terms are defined is dependent on human cognition.
Right, like I can say it's true that Harry Potter was killed by Avada Kedavra spell or whatever, but if by that all we mean is that we've defined the terms in such a way that it corresponds to the book of Harry Potter, sure, but there's a difference in the level of.
Are a little different. Fiction's a little different still, I think, but.
Well, there's a level of difference here between something constructed by human minds and something true independent of human minds. Because most people understand that when we want to know if something's real, we don't want to know if just a human mind made it up. It's not what we mean when we ask, is this real?
So is it true, independent of human minds, that the galaxy is so many, 100,000 light years wide?
Sure.
Is that something that's true, independent of human minds? Right, but we invented the term light year.
Yep.
I think it's true, independent of human minds, but the truth of that sentence relies on this term that we invented.
Sure, because that's all of those factors are determined independent of human minds. So the speed of light, we don't determine.
Is it true that the universe is also, let's say, so many feet the galaxy is so many feet wide.
Sure.
Is that true independent of human minds? Okay, so then we do our conversion from the fact that it's true independent of human minds that the universe is this many feet wide, and it's true independent of human minds that it's this many light years wide, right? Then we can derive that there are so many feet in a light year. And now it turns out that it's true independent of human minds that there are X number of feet in a light year.
Sure, but that would mean that we are
Which
light
is what
year
you denied
realists.
earlier on, right? You said that was something we created, that there are so many inches in a foot.
Well, we didn't create the speed of light, and so
we created.
Well, so like we can take an
All right,
actual
we
thing.
can do it. We don't have to do it with light years. We could do it with feet and inches. Is it true, independent of human minds, that the galaxy is so many feet wide?
No.
No, it is true, independent of human minds, it's so many light years wide, and it's so. But you already said that. I already put it in feet, and you said yes.
Well, yeah. So if we transfer
your answer.
Wait. So the difference here is that I'm not a foot realist. Feet don't really exist. I am a light year realist. That's a real thing because the light travels a certain speed over here for sure. And so that is corresponded to some physical fact of reality that is true independent of human minds. What a foot is, that doesn't exist. We could just make that whatever we wanted to, and it would make zero difference.
It's kind of something we defined too.
Oh yeah, but it's the correspondence to the distance light travels. So we can change the time frame to whatever we want, but whatever we change the time frame to is still going to have the same proportionality to light. So we can get rid of the time frame completely and just make it into an equation that says light travels X amount of time in X amount of whatever. And so that's a fact of reality, completely independent of human minds. We get no say in that whatsoever. Foot, completely arbitrary. We can make that whatever we want. No limitations there because there's no direct correspondence to reality in that way. But so I wouldn't be a foot realist. I would be a light year realist or a light speed realist. And in the case of morality, I don't see what the light speed would be. All I see is that there's a psychological, I see the foot. The foot is like our feelings, and we can make those whatever we want. But I don't see what the light speed would be. The light speed would have to be something true independent of humans. And then once we had that, then we could say, yes, here's our light speed conversion metric thingy.
I don't think that's going to work if we push on it.
With what?
I don't think what you just said is going to work if we push on it, right? So a light year depends on the concept of a year, which is something we invented, right? So a light year is, in a certain sense, just as much an invention as a foot is. And it's just as true that, some segment it's just as objectively true that some segment is so many light years wide as it is so many feet wide. You would, as a scientist, you wouldn't say, you wouldn't convert from, say, light years to feet and say, oh my God, you've gone from objective truths to mere subjective stuff. Right? The units are all equally good.
Well,
we invent units, and then we talk about the world in terms of them, and whether the world matches our unit specifications is a physical fact that's independent of us.
Right. So I'd agree.
About it in a certain way is due to us, but the facts out there, once we specify how we talk about it, then the facts out there either correspond to what we said or don't. And the fact that we say it a certain way doesn't make it non-scientific or non-objective in any problematic sense.
Well, I would think it would be problematic if we took out the light part. So if we're referencing a frame of time and corresponding it to some feature of reality which has a fixed rate, the speed of light, it's fixed. Now we can get rid of the year part. The year part doesn't matter. Say with any time reference we want relative to the speed of light, it's now tied to some objective ruler. There is now a ruler in the universe, and it tells us this is right, everything else is wrong. The ruler,
there's a standard foot too, and a standard meter, and a standard second, right, for whatever term you want.
I mean,
there's a standard meter. Maybe there isn't a standard foot, but there could have been.
I don't know. Like, I don't think there's a thing in reality to which that corresponds. Whereas there is a thing in reality to which speed corresponds relative to the speed of light. But I don't see what is the thing in reality to which goodness corresponds. And that's the part I'm
It's
not
not
seeing.
correspondence.
It's not
It's
correspondence.
constitution.
What does that mean?
So good is constituted by pleasure and other such things. It's not that there's some further thing that it needs to correspond to.
But wouldn't that apply to just any arbitrary distinction we made? So we can say like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like the good, the cool animals are the ones with 4 legs or something. Like the coolness, what is the word? Not corresponds. What was the other word? Comprises. Constitutes. So the cool animals group is constituted by all animals with 4 legs or something. That seems completely arbitrary. It doesn't seem like that would be an objective, or you couldn't be like a realist about coolness at that point. Even though you could say that there is some arbitrary set of traits that we label as coolness, I don't think that you would go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So if I say call, and use some term, let's not use cool. Let's use blinket. Call blinket any animal with 4 legs. Then there's an objective fact about whether that animal over there is blinket or not. Right?
Sure.
So I just invented that term.
Yep.
Now, if you, instead of saying blinket, say cool, but by cool, I just mean has 4 legs, then that's fine too. Right? Now, you've chosen a term that's confusing because we use it to mean other things and it's got all these associations. So you've made a kind of pragmatic mistake by using cool instead of blinket. Now, if you want to define something 2 ways at the same time, then you make an empirical commitment. You get one thing for free when you make a definition, right? You can either, let's say that you want part of your conception of coolness to be that these are things we should aesthetically appreciate, right? Now, if we define coolness as both all animals with 4 legs and things we should aesthetically appreciate, now we've defined cool in 2 ways simultaneously, and we've taken a risk, right? So if it's not the case that we should aesthetically appreciate all things with 4 legs, then our definition is broken.
Right. So I'm just going with the first part, the blanket.
Right.
You can just go with blanket.
As long as you're going just blanket and you don't bring anything else, you kind of get one aspect of a definition for free.
Well, would you be a blanket realist then? Would you label yourself as a blanket realist?
Sure.
Because that seems to be like making a secondary claim. It seems like we've made up a term to refer to something in reality, and we're saying that term, the essence of it actually exists. There are things
that either are 4-legged or not. Blanket's just a synonym for 4-legged, right? Am I a realist about whether animals have 4 legs? Yeah.
Sure. That seems like it's like if I was a Platonic realist, I would be saying that there is a thing that actually exists that instantiates. And I'm just using the word to describe the thing. The word doesn't matter. Word's irrelevant. And so if I'm a realist about the Platonic object of morality, I'm saying it exists out there. And you're saying instead of a Platonic object, you're just saying well-being is the object to which you're saying the word good corresponds to, or something along those lines.
Something along those lines, yeah.
All right. And that's interesting. It seems like a very fluid particular to choose.
But once we've chosen it, then I get my realism for free, right? Just like I get to be a blanket realist. So we do a careful act of choosing. We say, okay, by definition, here's what I'm going to mean by morality. And it's just going to be equivalent to pleasure and flourishing and well-being and promoting those things, actions and behaviors and attitudes that constitute those things. It's going to be a little complex, right? But once I've said, okay, that thing that's what I mean by morality. Well, now I get to be a realist because that really exists. Pleasure and such really exists.
Could moral subjectivists or moral relativists or non-cognitivists say, yeah, okay, I understand what you mean by the term, but I'm still a moral non-realist because I don't think that's what morality means, because I think morality must be more than just we're just labeling this set of things as moral?
They might not think I'm realist enough for their tastes, right? So I mean, I can imagine both. I mean, so in philosophy, this is kind of considered a deflationary move, right? So in a deflationary view, what you do is you take, I guess it's really famous in the free will debate, right? So there are people in the free will debate who are compatibilists who say, hey, look, by freedom, I just mean, right, you're not constrained by outside forces to do things you don't want to do, right? As long as you can act according to your desires, you're free, even if those desires were ultimately caused by other things, right? That's what a compatibilist says. And then there are two other groups, libertarians and hard determinists, who say, no, freedom has to be much more than that. Freedom involves you have to be able to make a choice that contravenes the laws of physics, and if you can't, then you're not free. And the libertarian says, and you can, so you are free. And the hard determinist says, and you can't, so you're not free, right? So there's this kind of three-way disagreement. So you can do the same thing with moral realism. I mean, this is probably old hat to you and maybe even your listeners, right? But you can be a deflationist and say, hey, look, I'm a moral realist, but I don't think moral realism has to have some kind of juicy where you kick up against a moral fact and stub your toe, right? If you think moral facts are things that are separate from all of the stuff that we know about and talk about in psychology and physics, and you need to have that kind of separate ontological category in order for there to be moral facts, well, then I would say moral facts don't exist. But I don't think you need that, right? It's like the compatibilist saying, I don't think you need to have contra-causal causation in order to be free, right? So I'm a deflationist in the sense that I think, look, we can define morality in the way that I just did, and that exists, and that's all we should want when we say that there are moral facts.
Awesome. Last question. Do we need oughts? Do you have to have an ought that actually exists objectively in there?
Same answer. You ought to do what's good, right? And it's going to have the same kind of basic meta ethics behind it.
Awesome. All right. Well, we've been going for about an hour. Really appreciate you coming on. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
Yeah, I think probably the work would be most interesting to this audience would be my most recent book, A Theory of Jerks and Other Philosophical Misadventures, where I get into various issues about morality and moral psychology. The title essay, A Theory of Jerks, is also available free online, so you can check that out at Aeon.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks for having me.